Hi, everybody, and welcome back to AEG's podcast. Today we have our special guest, Kelly Gagnon. I am delighted that you're here, Michel, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you for having me, Catherine, and congrats to the Alberta Enterprise Group. I've been following you guys, and you're doing some great stuff.
Oh, thank you. And we've been following you and Montreal Economic Institute as well. So thank you for all your good work. I'm curious, though. I've had the opportunity of getting to know you personally and, of course, professionally, and I'm wondering why you're moving from Quebec to Alberta in July. Tell us what prompted the move.
Yes, and well, I've been thinking about it for a couple of years now. I think, as a preface, I should say that over the past 20 years, I've probably visited Alberta around 60 times or so.
Wow.
More often than not for business, but sometimes for leisure as well. And so, I've always been in love with the province, with its people, and and the general mentality. Although this is a generalization, the general mentality in Alberta, or certainly in southern Alberta, is closer to my own, worldviews and mentality. So I guess I feel more at ease in many respects in Alberta than in Quebec. And then there was a career opportunity because my organization, and I guess we'll get to that in a minute, but my organization, which has been rebranded to M.E.I, a bit like the Bank of Montreal is now BMO, has opened last November an office in downtown Calgary at the Edison building. And so there was that. And plus, I won't lie, there is a tax aspect to it. The tax savings, according to my accountant, like tax savings that my wife and I are going to be making, just because of the difference in personal income tax, Quebec versus Alberta, is actually going to be quite tangible. So that's not the first reason, but it's certainly a reason.
That makes sense to me. Thank you for sharing that, Michel. And why downtown Calgary? Tell us exactly about that, the reason why.
Well, I mean, that's for our office, and the reason was simply that we have one of our generous donor that was, kind enough to make part of his offices, available to us at no cost. So I think
Oh,
that was a no-brainer. As far as where we will buy our home, it hasn't been decided yet. We have a real estate agent in Alberta that's presenting to us options. And I would say right now we're looking at certain neighborhoods in Calgary. If you have suggestions, I'm a taker. But we're also interested in the lovely town of Cochrane, which
oh, yeah.
seems like a nice compromise between not too far from Calgary, but also with a view on your beautiful mountains.
You're right. It's beautiful. Well, no matter where you choose, every spot has its own beauty. That's for sure. I'm delighted. Thank you. Tell us more about your organization, MEI.
Yeah, and so it's a public policy think tank. So we study and comment on government policies, but we also accompany policymakers. So that is, elected officials and their staffers in the process of the adoption of certain policies. And so there's a research aspect, and then there's what we call a personalized transmission of our work that we do on a request basis. In other words, these are requests that come from the policymakers to us. And then I would say that there's an advocacy part, but I would call that more like social advocacy, in the sense that it's not to defend one specific legislation or one specific business, but more what I would call a vision of society. And in our case, that vision of society is free enterprise. It's personal and individual liberties, respect for private property, all these good things that were sort of taken for granted, but we've seen over the past few years that these principles actually have to be defended because otherwise you can find that what may seem obvious is not so obvious for a lot of our fellow citizens and for a lot of elected officials who are well-meaning but who don't necessarily understand or care that much for the principles of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you. And you've been working actively in energy policies in Canada with focus on oil and gas since 2009. Tell us more about the breadth and the purpose of that work.
Yes. So I think it stemmed from initially a conversation that I had with a well-known business person in Quebec who had contacts, including was a friend with the CEO of a major Canadian oil and gas company. And, he felt and his contact felt that there was a very irrational conversation about oil and gas issues across Canada at the federal level, but also you could say in central/eastern Canada, mainly Ontario and Quebec, where sometimes just the basic facts about the Canadian oil and gas industries were ignored, or in some cases there were just outright misinformation that was being spread. So I think that was the initial trust of our work, was just to, I would say, set the record straight, which is still a part of what we do, an important part of what we do. But there's also then original research about the economic and social aspects of the Canadian oil and gas industries. And a bit more recently, we've started to also look at the geopolitical component of it, and basically to use the title of a news article or an opinion piece that was published, I believe, in the Globe and Mail, 10 months ago or 8 months ago, a vision of Canada as an arsenal for democracy, in the sense of Canadian oil, potentially, if we had the right, energy infrastructure, our oil and gas could replace oil and gas coming from, dictatorial countries or aggressive countries who, in many cases, fund their tyrannical regimes through their oil and gas revenues. So I guess this is another angle that we've been explaining to our fellow citizens, especially in Quebec, but not only in Quebec, that, there are some rational economic and environmental reasons in favor of our Canadian oil and gas industry, but there are also moral and ethical reasons for it. And so I guess it's that whole slew of argumentation and analysis. And I invite people, if they Google our name, Montreal Economic Institute, or if they go at iedn.org, we have a fully bilingual website, and they will be able to see that since 2010, we've probably produced anywhere close to, I'm going to say, 80 to 90 publications that are relevant to the Canadian oil and gas industry, either directly or indirectly. So there's really a wealth of knowledge there. And I would invite your members to take a peek at it. And again, it's available in French and in English. And so they can even read it in English and then practice their French by reading the French version.
Well, as you could hear from my French earlier, I need much practice, perhaps starting over. Thank you, Michel. That's excellent. And I'm curious about the Quebec-Alberta dialogue. I've been to Montreal and Quebec City. I actually think there's more alignment than not. So I'm curious to learn more about that. Where did the idea come from? And how did you give it life over the years?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to a conversation I had with Preston Manning, probably 15 years ago. And then it culminated and took sort of a more concrete form as of 2009, 2010. And the idea is really how it sounds, right? It's to disseminate information and to organize events that facilitate a dialogue between Quebec and Alberta. And you are right in saying that at least on the autonomous portion of it, this notion that both provinces, don't want to be treated as if they were somehow the child of Ottawa, a child, to be almost disciplined. And so I think that's certainly a point in common and has been. There also, I would say, there's sort of a mentality style that, especially if you go into the regions of Alberta and the regions outside of Montreal and Quebec, you have, even mentality wise, some similarities. Now, let us not gloss over the fact that, there are also important disagreement, especially when it comes to energy infrastructure. But even there, when you look at the polling that we've been doing, and this is another thing that your members might be interested in, for 10 years now, every year we've been doing one and sometimes two polls comparing opinions of Canadians in different provinces about oil and gas issues and energy issues more broadly. And what you see is that actually Quebecers, if you ask them, would you like a world where there are zero emissions and no oil and gas and it's costing you nothing and everything would be perfect? I mean, of course, if you frame the questions in those terms, they will say that they want that. But if you bring it in more realistic terms and you ask Quebecers, and we've been doing that again for 10 years, every year, what do you prefer? Do you prefer oil coming from the United States, from Western Canada, from Europe, from Saudi Arabia, whatever? Then frame in those terms, Western Canadian oil is systematically something like 50 to 55 points of percentage more, I would say, in demand or more asked for by Quebecers than any other origin. So I think the presumed hostility is very much something that, presumed hostility of Quebecers against the Alberta oil and gas industry is mostly something that has been peddled and pushed forwards by the elites, by journalists, by commentators. But when you look at the polling amongst the general public of Quebec, they're much more amicable to Alberta and the Alberta oil and gas industry than the elites
Mm-hmm. This
are.
has been my experience as well. Thank you for confirming that, Michel. What are your thoughts on our Premier, Alberta Premier Smith, and of course our Saskatchewan Premier, and how they've been more assertive in the deployment of their jurisdictional powers related to the federal government?
Well, in the case of Premier Danielle Smith, I have to disclose that I consider her as a personal friend. We haven't been directly in touch for a couple of years now, but we have a friendship, and I have a very high regard of her, and I hope I actually know that she feels the same way. So there's a friendship there, but aside from that, her worldviews and the way she approaches politics and political challenges is very much in tune with my own views of the world. So I'm not talking here, as CEO of M.E.I. I'm just making a comment as a private citizen that, that I am very much aligned. But if I take a step back and look at the more policy oriented portion of your question, obviously there was the Alberta Sovereignty Act, and in Saskatchewan they had a softer version, but that was of the same spirit. And what I should say is I'm not a constitutional law expert, and so I cannot speak with authority with regarding the legal aspect of these provincial laws. It's been, as you know, commented upon quite a bit, in the public domain. I will leave that portion of the debate to the people who know about constitutional law or who pretend they know about constitutional law. So I'll remain neutral on that front. What I did say is when you look at it not only from a legal perspective, but from what we could describe as real politics, right? The really as how politics works in the real world. Well, historically, the provinces that were able to get, more power, or let's say more freedom relative to the federal government, were the provinces, and more specifically Quebec, that basically took those liberties and asserted themselves. And so I wrote an opinion piece, which is available on our website and probably, in other outlets. Maybe, you could put a link on it with your podcast, but I did write a piece on that very specific topic for the Calgary Herald, I believe. And that's exactly the point I was making, is that regardless of the technical legal aspect, if Alberta wants to be more respected, it has to be more assertive in protecting its autonomy, and not just in rhetoric, but through actual consequential policy decisions. And I think in that article, in that opinion piece, I listed, a series of concrete actions that the Alberta government or the Saskatchewan government or any provincial government for that matter that would want to, be more assertive of its powers could take. And so basically what I'm saying is, in terms of the general direction, I give a 2 thumbs up to the Smith government in at least expressing the desire to really go into that direction. And again, putting aside, technical legal issues as to whether or not, the Alberta Sovereignty Act is partly constitutional or partly unconstitutional. Of course, these matters, these topics matter greatly. Mm-hmm. But the general sentiment, I think, is something that many Quebecers and many Albertans, going back to the Alberta dialogue, do feel that they want their provinces to be as autonomous as it was initially construed by the Canadian Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Yes, awesome. Thank you. Thanks for your comments. So I understand that your role as CEO is changing after 21 years of making a difference in the way that you have. What will your new role be, and how does your professional life look after this?
Yes, well, basically what I have decided is that I will soon be only doing the things I like and none of the things I dislike. And so I guess in that sense, I'm becoming a little bit like a millennial or a Generation Z. I'm going back and maybe becoming younger. No, but more seriously, it's just trying to focus on my strengths. And so, my official title as of April 5th or April 6th will be founding president. Okay. I'll remain involved with the organization, but I will focus on, public speaking engagements, networking, business development, that kind of stuff, and less, on managing employees, managing the board and things like that, which are not, they're important, very important tasks, especially when you take them seriously. But they're also extremely energy and time consuming. And I just felt that, if I could pass the baton a younger person within our organization, Daniel Dufort, who's currently our vice president operations, and who will be, taking on as CEO. And I think, he'll do a great job. And this again will allow me to focus on things that are more of interest, and also, and we might talk about that in a minute, but of other projects that are not directly related to M.E.I, and for which I will have more time to devote to other ventures.
That's exciting. Well, yes, and I've heard about Sage Roots Foundation and that you're involved in that project in some way. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, and so it's a business person, businessman Michael Binion, and Chief Jimmy Boucher, and others who have prompted this initiative that aims at alleviating poverty on native reservations, and more generally, for native people, through entrepreneurship and wealth creation, and through a perspective about energy issues that is a constructive one. And the idea was that, or the idea is that, having such a voice like that, but with, a perspective or voices that are either geared toward native people or coming from native, leaders, that would be a very positive addition to the overall, portfolio of similar organizations that exist in Quebec. Now, the organization is really in its startup phase, but the vision is that vision of a native voice for and by native people that will look at the world, from a perspective that is both respectful of their traditions, but also respectful of the ideas of entrepreneurship and wealth creation.
Well, I look forward to learning more. That is awesome. And thank you for your service in that area too. Excellent. And you were published. You've got a short illustrated novel from 2021. Where can we buy it?
Yes, so folks can buy it on Amazon.ca, and it's called Base Type Nil. And again, I guess we can put a link to your show so that people could buy it. And quite frankly, my sales for the French version have been decent, but almost non-existent for the English version. So I'm hoping that your show will provide a bit of pickup for it. And so it's a short novel with cartoons in it. The cartoons, I commissioned it to a very young, talented young man who, happened to be autistic, but has, a very creative and talented mind. And it's dark humor. It's also slightly futuristic. So it takes place, we could presume, in about 7 years from now, or 7 years from towards the middle of the pandemic. And the main storyline, without stealing any punches, is that the main character gets hit by a bus. And again, we presume it's sometime in 2021. And then he falls into a coma for 7 years. Wow. And when he wakes up in a world where all the bad philosophical ideas and all the bad economic ideas have been applied, and he has to deal with this dystopian world. And there are clear hints to, certain, Canadian journalists. There are clear hints to certain Canadian politicians, although Canada is not named specifically in the novel. And you know what? I've had, fairly prestigious novelist, that made the best New York Times bestseller list, saying that it's quite an interesting novel. There's also one of the main political commentator in Quebec who wrote a book about wokeism and about political correctness, who sort of says that I'm taking a pretty energetic stab at wokeness and political correctness. So I think anyone that has a bit of a critical mind, a bit of a small L libertarian or small conservative, worldview, I think will probably take a lot of pleasure in reading that book. And it's I wrote it having in mind what I would like. So because like I would guess almost all your listeners or most of your listeners, I'm extremely busy. And so often I take a novel, I'm initially motivated about reading it. I get through, 20, 30, 40, 50 pages, and then I just drop it because I'm too busy, right?
Yes, yes.
And so this product has been conceived as something that someone who reads at a natural pace, a normal pace, could read it within an hour and a half, 2 hours, maybe 2 hours and a half.
Awesome.
And so I just think it's fun to be able to take a cultural product like that and get through it within, say, 2 hours.
Well, I look forward to reading it. I know it'll take me longer than 2 hours, but I'll definitely pick it up. Michel, thank you. Anything else on your mind before we close?
Well, I'm looking forward to come to Alberta, and I'm looking forward to continue my engagement with you and with your group. I think that Alberta is already an incredibly interesting place with a lot of potential, but I think its comparative advantage as yet to be fully appreciated. And I really think that Alberta will be the beacon of Canada for the next 15 to 20 years. I really believe that.
I agree with you, Michel. Thank you so much for your comments today, sharing your vision for our province and making Canada a better place to live. I love all the work that you and your team have done, and I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
Thank you. Everyone, Michel Kelly Gagnon with M.E.I. currently, and of course, he will be moving on to a very cool initiative that I look forward to learning more about. Thank you again for joining us on AEG's podcast.